A poor boy helped an elderly woman cross the street. A week later, she showed up at his door with an unbelievable offer. Noah walked through the dusty streets of the neighborhood, his worn-out shoes kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. He was only 15, but the weight of life had aged him prematurely. At his age, other boys were playing soccer in the parks or going to school with backpacks full of books, while he roamed the streets selling small items, gum, lighters, anything that could bring in a few bills to help his family's precarious situation. Life had taught him, through hard lessons, that nothing would come easily. The midday sun beat down on him mercilessly, but Noah had no time to rest. Ever since his mother Lily had fallen ill, every day was a race against the clock. The medical bills piled up, and despite his efforts, the money was never enough. Lily, a woman who had once been strong and hard-working, was now just a shadow of her former self. The illness had slowly consumed her, and each time she coughed, the sound pierced Noah's heart like a knife. He knew time was running out. As he walked, his pockets half empty after a tough morning of sales, Noah thought of his mother. He remembered how she used to be before she got sick, a vibrant woman, always ready to laugh, to care for him with love, and work hard to give him the best. But now, with each passing day, Lily grew weaker. The doctors had been clear. If she didn't receive specialized treatment soon, things would get worse. But that treatment was far beyond what they could afford. When Noah returned home in the evenings, he always found Lily lying on the old sofa in the living room, covered with a thin blanket that wasn't enough to keep her fragile body warm. Each day was the same. The small apartment they lived in was falling apart, much like their hopes. The once white walls were now stained and worn by time and humidity. The furniture was old, barely standing, but despite everything, that place was still their home. Within those four walls, Lily remained the woman who had raised him with love. "Mom, I'm home," Noah said, trying to sound optimistic as he removed his sweaty shirt and sat beside her. Lily gave him a weak smile, but Noah could see the effort it took just to do that. She always tried to stay strong for him, never wanting to burden him with her pain. But Noah could see it in her eyes. Every breath, every movement was a struggle. And yet, Lily insisted everything would be okay. "How did it go today, son?" Lily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Noah shrugged and took her hand. It was cold to the touch, as if the illness had stolen even her warmth. "The usual, sold a few things, but—" He paused, unable to lie to her. "Not enough." Lily closed her eyes and nodded. There was no reproach in her gaze, just a silent acceptance of their reality. Noah squeezed her hand a little tighter, as if by doing so, he could give her some of his own strength. "Don't worry about me, Noah," Lily said softly. "What matters is that you're here. I'm proud of you." But Noah couldn't stop worrying. Every cough from his mother was a reminder of how fragile their situation was. He knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. He had to find a way to get the money for the medicine she needed. Time was slipping away, and Noah felt it slipping through his fingers like sand. That thought haunted him day and night. No matter how hard he tried to stay strong, there were moments when despair consumed him. On the quietest nights, when the only sound was Lily's labored breathing from the other room, Noah lay staring at the ceiling, wondering if they would ever escape their misery, if his mother would ever be the vibrant woman he remembered. But those questions only added to the weight on his shoulders. The day had been long, but it wasn't over yet. Noah got up, determined to prepare something for dinner, even if it was just a simple soup. He knew Lily barely had an appetite, but he had to try. He couldn't do much for her health, but at least he could make sure she had something in her stomach. As he stirred the soup in the old pot, his thoughts returned again and again to the same point. He needed more money. The few bills he had earned that day weren't enough. The situation was becoming more and more unsustainable, and Noah saw no clear way out. That night, while Lily slept, Noah stepped out onto the small balcony of the apartment. He looked up at the stars, wondering if there was someone, somewhere, who could help them. But as always, the only answer he received was silence. The sun was starting to rise, and with it, the scorching heat of the day. As always, Noah walked the neighborhood streets with his small box of goods. He had already visited the usual places, the corners where workers took breaks, the small parks where some children played, and the sidewalks he walked up and down, hoping to sell something more. As he walked, fatigue began to take over, but he couldn't afford to rest. Every minute without a sale was another minute his mother went without the treatment she needed. As he made his way down one of the main avenues of the neighborhood, something caught Noah's attention. An elderly woman stood on the sidewalk, looking nervously at the fast-moving traffic. She wore a grey coat that seemed outdated, far too heavy for the day's heat, and in her hands, she held a shopping bag. Her movements were slow, careful, as if every step cost her great effort. The chaos of the traffic around her had left her frozen in place, and Noah, always observant, couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy when he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. Instinctively, Noah set aside his own worries for a moment and approached the elderly woman. "Ma'am, do you need help?" he asked, his kindness seeming to come naturally. The elderly woman looked up at him, visibly relieved by his presence. There was something in her eyes, a mix of exhaustion and loneliness, that felt familiar to Noah. It was the same kind of look he often saw in his mother's eyes. "Oh, thank you, young man," the woman responded with a trembling voice. "I need to cross the street, but the cars... I just can't." Noah nodded, understanding. Without saying more, he extended his arm so the elderly woman could lean on him. Patiently, he waited for the right moment to help her cross the avenue. The traffic was still chaotic, but Noah didn't flinch. He knew how to move between cars and motorcycles, and what was routine for him was a monumental challenge for the woman. Finally, they made it across the street. The elderly woman looked at him with gratitude, her eyes shining with a silent acknowledgement. There weren't enough words to express what she felt, but Noah didn't expect any. For him, helping someone in need was natural, something that was simply done without expecting anything in return. "Thank you, young man. Truly, I don't know how I would have done it without you," said the elderly woman, as she pulled a few coins from her pocket and offered them to him. "Please take this. It's the least I can do for you." Noah looked at the coins and then at the elderly woman. For a moment, he thought about what those coins could mean. He could buy some food for his mother, or maybe save up for the medicine she so desperately needed. But his pride, the same pride that had kept him going all these years, wouldn't allow him to accept charity. "It's not necessary, ma'am," he said with a kind smile, gently pushing her hand back. "I'm just glad I could help." The elderly woman looked at him, surprised. It wasn't common for someone to turn down a reward, especially a young boy who seemed to be in need like Noah. For a few seconds, their eyes met, and something in the woman's gaze changed. It was as if she was seeing beyond the young boy who had helped her, as if she could sense the invisible burden he carried. Her hands trembled slightly as she put the coins away, but her gaze remained fixed on Noah. "You're a good boy, I can tell," the elderly woman said, her voice full of unexpected warmth. "It's not every day you find someone who helps out of the kindness of their heart." Noah, uncomfortable with the attention, simply nodded and prepared to leave. His mind was already returning to the reality of his day-to-day. He needed to keep selling, needed to keep fighting to keep his mother alive. "Take care of yourself, young man," the elderly woman added, before slowly walking away, but not without giving him one last look, as if she wanted to imprint his image in her memory. As he watched her walk away, Noah felt a slight discomfort in his stomach. There was something about the way she looked at him that wasn't like the usual looks of pity he received from adults. It was a look that made him feel seen, as if his struggles weren't invisible to her. Determined not to dwell on it, Noah continued on his way. He knew that, at the end of the day, none of it mattered. He had to sell more. had to earn enough to return home with more than just the promise that tomorrow would be better. But despite his efforts, that afternoon turned out to be particularly bad for sales. The streets were emptier than usual, and the few people he did see passed by without even glancing at him. When he finally got home that night, Noah felt defeated. He entered the small apartment and found Lily on the sofa, as usual, covered with her thin blanket. Her breathing was slow, but the effort in each inhalation was still noticeable. Noah sat beside her, exhausted, and took her hand. "Today wasn't a good day," he said quietly, trying not to worry her too much. Lily gave him her usual weak smile, the one she always used when she wanted to reassure him. "Don't worry, son," she murmured. "As long as we're together, that's all that matters." Noah nodded, but his heart was restless. He couldn't go on like this much longer. He knew he had to find a solution, but each passing day made that solution seem further and further away. That night, as he tried to sleep, the image of the elderly woman came back to his mind. Who was she? Why did he feel that their brief encounter had been more significant than it seemed? But soon, exhaustion took over, and his thoughts faded into darkness. What Noah didn't know at that moment was that the elderly woman wasn't just any ordinary person, and that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The sound of Lily's cough woke Noah in the middle of the night. Though he was used to it, every time he heard that cough, a knot formed in his stomach. He knew it wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a constant reminder of how fragile his mother's life was. Hearing it, he quickly jumped out of bed and rushed to the living room, where she slept, wrapped in the same thin blanket that offered her so little comfort. When he arrived, Lily was sitting on the sofa, breathing heavily. Her face, marked by deep circles under her eyes and a pale complexion, showed an exhaustion that words couldn't describe. Noah, still half asleep, knelt beside her. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked softly, taking her hand. Lily gave him a weak smile, one that tried to hide the pain she felt. "Just a rough moment, son. Don't worry, it'll pass," she whispered, trying to reassure him as she always did. Noah nodded, but he couldn't help but notice how fragile his mother was becoming. Each day she seemed weaker, and though he tried to stay hopeful, fear gnawed at him from the inside. He sat beside her, watching her in silence. He knew she was being brave for him, but they both knew the illness was advancing quickly, and without proper treatment, it was only a matter of time. The doctors had been clear. The treatment Lily needed was expensive, far too expensive for someone like them. The bills kept coming, and though Noah did everything he could by selling on the streets, the money was never enough. It seemed as though life had turned its back on them, and despair grew inside him more and more with each passing day. The silence in the small house was almost unbearable. Noah remembered how life used to be before his mother's illness. Laughter filled the house, the days were brighter, and everything seemed to make more sense. But now, every corner of the house seemed to be covered in a shadow that threatened to consume them. "Noah," Lily's weak voice broke the silence. "I want you to know something." Noah looked at her, expectant. "No matter what happens, I've always been proud of you. You've been my greatest joy, and I want you to know that what you've done for me, I'll never forget." Those words, though comforting, pierced Noah's heart. It was as if Lily was saying goodbye, preparing him for the inevitable. But he wasn't ready to say goodbye. He refused to accept that this could be their reality. "Mom, don't talk like that. I'm not going to lose you. We'll get the money, I promise," he responded with determination, though his voice trembled with uncertainty. Lily gave his hand a gentle squeeze and closed her eyes, trying to rest. Noah stayed by her side, staring out the window as the moonlight filtered through the worn-out curtains. His thoughts drifted to the past, to a time when life was different. Noah was 5 years old when his father, Roberto, abandoned them. Until then, he had been a happy child with a family that, though humble, had always been full of love. Roberto had been a hard-working man, but also unstable. He never stayed in one place or one job for long. The fights between his parents had become more frequent, and one day, without any explanation, Roberto simply left, leaving them alone. Noah vividly remembered the day his father closed the door for the last time. His mother had cried for hours, but eventually she had gotten up and continued to fight for him. Lily had always been a strong woman, determined to move forward despite the difficulties. However, the illness had come without warning, and the strength that once defined her began to fade. Since then, Noah had learned to rely only on his mother, and she on him. Together, they were a team, fighting against the world. But the illness was winning, and Noah felt that the responsibility of saving his mother fell entirely on his shoulders. Back in the present, Noah watched Lily sleep, her breathing weak but steady. He knew he had to do something, and soon. He couldn't afford to lose her. His thoughts returned to the encounter he had had earlier that morning with the elderly woman on the street. Although it had been a brief act of kindness, something about her gaze still lingered in his mind. It was as if that woman had seen something in him that he didn't even recognize. He wondered why he kept thinking about her, but quickly pushed those thoughts aside. He had more urgent problems to solve. The following days were the same, selling on the streets, caring for his mother, and living under the constant shadow of uncertainty. Each passing day, Lily seemed more fragile, and Noah more desperate. He couldn't afford to fail, but every effort he made seemed to be in vain. The nights grew longer, filled with thoughts that kept him awake. The fear of the unknown enveloped him, and for the first time in a long time, he began to feel like he was fighting alone. But something was about to change. What Noah didn't know was that the elderly woman, the one he had helped cross the street without asking for anything in return, hadn't forgotten his gesture. And that small act of kindness would soon set in motion a series of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Noah looked at his mother one last time before going to bed, promising himself that he would find a solution. No matter how impossible it seemed, he wouldn't give up. His love for Lily was the only thing keeping him going, and as long as she was alive, he would keep fighting. With that determination, Noah prepared for another day of work, unaware that destiny was already in motion, and his life was about to take an unexpected turn. The next day began like any other for Noah. He got up early, got ready quickly, and before leaving, checked on his mother. Lily was asleep, though her heavy, labored breathing still reminded him of the urgency of the situation. Each day that passed, the fear of losing her grew, and the urgency to find a solution suffocated him. With a sigh, Noah left their small home, ready to roam the streets again, trying to make some money with his sales. However, that day felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the accumulation of weeks of struggle. Perhaps it was the lack of hope. But something inside him made him feel like he was reaching his limit. As Noah walked along the dusty sidewalks, with the sun already beating down hard on the back of his neck, he wondered how much longer he could endure. But in the middle of his thoughts, something caught his attention as he turned the corner toward his house. A shiny black car, far too luxurious for his humble neighborhood, was parked right in front of his door. Noah stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. No one in his neighborhood owned a car like that, and even less likely would they park it on his street without a specific reason. The car seemed out of place, as if it didn't belong in the world Noah lived in. His mind began racing with thoughts. Had something happened to his mother? To a neighbor? Why was that car there? Without waiting any longer, he sprinted toward his house, his mind filled with assumptions that only fueled his anxiety. When he arrived, he flung the door open, and what he saw left him frozen. Sitting on his shabby couch, with a tranquility that contrasted with the humble surroundings, was the elderly woman he had helped cross the street a week earlier, Mrs. Caroline. The contrast between her and his home was striking. Her elegant coat and distinguished demeanor made everything around her look even more worn down than it already was. "Noah, dear, a lady has come to see you," said Lily from her corner, her voice weak but evidently surprised. Noah didn't know what to say. He could barely process the scene. He had thought about the elderly woman several times since their encounter, but he had never imagined seeing her in his house, sitting next to his mother. Mrs. Caroline looked at him with a calm smile, but there was a determination in her eyes that Noah hadn't noticed the first time. She stood up slowly and walked toward him with a steady pace. "Noah, I want to thank you again for helping me that day," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But I didn't come here just to thank you." The silence in the room was thick. Lily looked at the woman, confused, while Noah felt Mrs. Caroline's words hanging in the air, unsure of what they meant. "I've been thinking a lot since we met," Caroline continued, stepping a little closer. "And I couldn't stop thinking about you, about your situation. You're a young man with a noble heart, Noah. I can see that what you're doing for your mother isn't something many would do. You have a strong spirit, but you can't do it all alone." Noah looked at Caroline with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. He wasn't used to someone, especially someone of her status, speaking to him with such kindness or offering help. He was used to being invisible to others, just the boy who sells things on the street. But Caroline was looking at him as if she saw beyond the surface. "I don't want to seem intrusive, but I see what's happening," Caroline said, casting a gentle look toward Lily, who was struggling to sit up on the couch. "I've spent most of my life surrounded by luxury, but those luxuries haven't brought me the happiness I expected. I've lost a lot over the years." She paused, and her eyes seemed to darken, as if a painful memory had surfaced. "And I can't stand by and watch someone like you, with so much potential and sacrifice, drown in despair." Noah, still silent, felt Caroline's words piercing through him. He knew he couldn't reject her help without hearing her out, but something in him, a mix of pride and fear, kept him distant. Caroline noticed and continued speaking. "I have a proposal for you, Noah. I want you and your mother to move into my house. It won't be a favor, but an opportunity. I know you need help to get Lily the right treatment, and I can provide that. I have the resources, but more than that, I want you to know that there are people in this world willing to help without asking for anything in return." The proposal landed like a bomb in Noah's small home. Lily, who had remained silent until then, tried to intervene. "We can't accept that. It wouldn't be right," she said in a faint voice, clearly struggling with the pride and shame of accepting charity from someone they barely knew. Caroline smiled, a tender and understanding smile. "This isn't charity, Lily. It's an act of gratitude and humanity. We all need help at some point, and now it's your turn to receive it." Noah felt a whirlwind of emotions. Mrs. Caroline's offer was more than tempting. It was what they had desperately needed, but accepting it meant admitting they couldn't do it alone, and that was a truth he found hard to swallow. "But why would you do this for us?" Noah finally asked, his voice full of doubt. Caroline looked him straight in the eyes, as if she had been waiting for that question. "Because you helped me without expecting anything in return. Because I saw in you a kindness that is rare, and I believe the world needs more people like you. And also," her voice dropped to a melancholic whisper, "because I know what it's like to lose someone important, and I don't want that to happen to you." The weight of those words resonated in Noah's heart. Caroline spoke with a contained sadness, a sadness that only someone who had lost a loved one knew well. "This isn't an obligation, Noah. The decision is yours," Caroline concluded, looking at him with warmth. "I just want to offer you an opportunity." Noah looked at his mother. Lily had closed her eyes, too tired to keep arguing. He knew that deep down, she also wanted to accept, but her pride wouldn't let her. And for the first time, Noah felt that maybe it was time to set that pride aside. "All right," Noah replied, his voice trembling but firm. "We'll accept." Mrs. Caroline's smile widened, not with triumph, but with satisfaction. She knew she had just changed the destiny of that family. And although Noah didn't know it yet, his life was about to take an entirely unexpected turn. The sound of the car's engine broke the silence of the journey. Noah, sitting in the back seat next to his mother, stared out the window with a mix of awe and nervousness. He had spent most of his life on the dusty streets of his neighborhood, surrounded by old buildings and people struggling to survive day by day. But as the car moved forward, the streets began to change. The humble houses and small shops gave way to wider avenues lined with lush trees and large mansions surrounded by tall walls and well-kept gardens. Lily, weak but alert, sat quietly. There was a mix of relief and fear in her eyes. On the one hand, she knew this was an opportunity to receive the treatment she so desperately needed, but on the other, the pride that had always sustained her made her feel uncomfortable with this sudden improvement in their situation. Noah, although silent, shared that feeling. Mrs. Caroline, seated in the front of the car, exchanged a few words with the driver. Though her tone was calm, it was impossible to ignore the authority that emanated from her. Despite her age, her presence dominated the space, and Noah couldn't help but feel a natural respect for her. There was something about Caroline that made him feel safe, though the natural distrust he carried inside still lingered. After what felt like eternal minutes, the car turned onto a long cobblestone driveway that led to an enormous mansion. Noah and Lily couldn't believe what they were seeing. The building was imposing, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens, crystal-clear fountains, and a wide entrance that gleamed under the afternoon sun. It was the kind of place they had only seen in movies or magazines, but never in person. The car stopped in front of the main entrance. Mrs. Caroline was the first to step out, greeting a butler who stood at the doors, and then she turned to Noah and Lily. "Welcome to my home," she said with a gentle smile. "Here, you'll be safe." Noah stepped out of the car, feeling the stone ground beneath his feet. As he helped his mother out, he couldn't stop looking at the place that would now be their new home, though the word home felt strange to describe such a grand place. The butler, a tall and thin man with an impassive expression, took Noah bags and carried them inside. Lily leaned on her son as they walked toward the entrance. Her legs, weakened by illness, seemed to tremble under her own weight, but she forced herself to stay steady. She knew all of this was for Noah, and she would do whatever was necessary for him to have a better life. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere was even more impressive. The foyer was vast, with high ceilings and crystal chandeliers that hung like stars shining in the night sky. The walls were adorned with old paintings and tapestries, and the white marble floor echoed with each step they took. Despite the beauty and luxury surrounding them, Noah couldn't shake the feeling of being out of place. Mrs. Caroline showed them to their rooms. Lily would be staying in one of the finest rooms, near a balcony with a view of the gardens. Noah, though more hesitant, would also have his own space, something he had never had in his previous home. The room was larger than his entire former apartment. He didn't know what to think. Was this the kind of life someone like him deserved? Or was it just a dream that would eventually shatter? "Please, settle in and rest. I've called a private doctor to evaluate Lily this afternoon," Mrs. Caroline announced. "And Noah, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Noah nodded silently, unsure of how to act in this new situation. Lily, exhausted from the trip, collapsed onto the bed, her body relieved by the soft mattress. Noah watched her, feeling a small ray of hope as he saw that his mother, at least for now, was in a safe place. Even so, there was an unsettling feeling in the air, a feeling that all of this was too good to be true. The doctor arrived that same afternoon, just as Mrs. Caroline had promised. He was an older man with grey hair and a professional but kind attitude. He examined Lily carefully, taking notes in a small notebook while she coughed weakly. Noah stayed by his mother's side the entire time, listening to every word, every diagnosis. The doctor explained that Lily's treatment would be long, but with proper care, there was hope. That word, hope, resonated in Noah's mind all day. It was something he wasn't used to. For so long, he had lived in despair, always expecting the worst-case scenario, that hearing someone talk about possible improvement felt strange. As Noah escorted the doctor out, he found himself face to face with something unexpected. Laura and Bradley, Mrs. Caroline's nieces and nephews, arriving at the mansion just at that moment. The expressions on their faces were of total surprise and displeasure at seeing Noah and the doctor together. Laura, a tall and elegant woman with a cold and calculating demeanor, was the first to speak. "And who might you be?" she asked with a raised eyebrow, looking at Noah as if he were an anomaly in her perfect world. Noah, uncomfortable, briefly introduced himself. "I'm Noah. My mother and I are staying here because Mrs. Caroline offered to let us." Bradley, her brother, with a more relaxed but equally sharp look, crossed his arms, clearly intrigued. "Oh, really? And why would our dear aunt offer that?" he asked with a sarcastic smile that made Noah feel even more out of place. Noah didn't know what to say. He knew his presence wouldn't be well received, but he hadn't expected such a direct confrontation so soon. At that moment, Mrs. Caroline appeared at the entrance, her expression serious, indicating that she knew exactly what was going on. "Noah and his mother will be living here with me. I've invited them, and I don't need to explain myself," Caroline said, with a firmness that cut through the air. Laura and Bradley exchanged a quick glance, and although they said nothing, it was evident they were not happy with the situation. However, they kept quiet for the moment, knowing their aunt wasn't someone they could easily contradict. "Very well, Aunt. I suppose you have your reasons," Laura finally replied, though her tone clearly showed her disagreement. Bradley simply smiled, a smile Noah didn't like at all. "We're here for dinner. Would you mind if we joined you?" Bradley asked, seemingly changing the subject, but Noah felt there was something more behind his words. Caroline nodded, and they all headed to the dining room, where a long, elegantly set table awaited them. During dinner, Noah felt the tension in the air. Laura and Bradley kept glancing at him out of the corner of their eyes, as if they were trying to figure out why he was there and what they could do about it. Noah, for his part, ate in silence, trying to stay calm but feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Lily hadn't come down to dinner, too weak to get out of bed, and Noah felt exposed without her by his side. Mrs. Caroline, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the discomfort, speaking kindly and softly, though everyone knew that beneath that calm, the tension was growing. Noah was beginning to realize that life in the mansion wasn't going to be as easy as it seemed. Despite Caroline's generosity, there were forces at play that he didn't fully understand, and the elderly woman's nieces and nephews clearly didn't see him in a favorable light. He knew something was about to unfold, but he didn't know what or when. The luxury of the mansion contrasted with the silent battle that was forming, and Noah understood that although they now had a safe roof over their heads and Lily's treatment was underway, they couldn't let their guard down. The days in Mrs. Caroline's mansion began with a superficial calm, but Noah couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on a tightrope. Although life in the house was far more comfortable than it had ever been, there was something in the air that kept him constantly alert. Lily continued to rest in her new, spacious room, receiving the medical treatment she so desperately needed. Though her health remained fragile, there was a glimmer of relief in her eyes, as if for the first time in a long while she could allow herself to breathe a little easier. Noah, however, couldn't relax. From the first dinner in the mansion, Laura and Bradley had made it clear, with subtle looks and comments, that they didn't want him there. Though they hadn't said it openly, the coldness with which they treated him was evident, as if he and his mother were intruders in a world they didn't belong to. One morning, Noah came downstairs and headed to the dining room for some coffee. The huge house was quiet, but as he crossed the foyer, he heard voices coming from the living room. As he got closer, he recognized Laura and Bradley's voices, who clearly didn't bother to lower their tone. "I can't believe Aunt Caroline brought those two here," Laura was saying, her voice icy. "What is she thinking? Has she gone crazy?" Bradley let out a mocking laugh. "I told you something was off. I wouldn't be surprised if those two are trying to squeeze money out of her. The woman is sick. It's clear they're looking to take advantage. Yes, and Noah, that boy, doesn't inspire any trust in me. There's something about him I don't like. They seem too desperate, as if they're just waiting for Aunt Caroline to give them what they need without lifting a finger. Noah, pressed against the wall, felt the heat rising in his chest. He didn't want to keep listening, but he couldn't move either. Laura and Bradley's words cut through him like knives, confirming his suspicions. They didn't see him as a person with real struggles, but as a threat, as someone who had come to take what they thought was theirs. "We have to do something, Bradley," Laura continued, now with a more serious tone. "We can't let them stay here. I don't want our inheritance ending up in the hands of those strangers." Bradley was silent for a moment, but then responded with a calculated voice. "You're right, but we can't be too obvious. Aunt Caroline trusts them, or at least trusts Noah. If we confront her directly, she might turn against us. We have to be smart." Noah stood frozen, feeling the weight of the conspiracy against him. He knew Laura and Bradley wouldn't stop. Now more than ever, he had to be careful, not just for himself, but for his mother. He couldn't let them hurt her, either physically or emotionally. With his heart racing, he decided to slip away before they discovered him. For the rest of the day, Noah couldn't shake the pressure of being under Laura and Bradley's critical gaze. Every step he took in the house, he felt as if they were watching him, judging his every move, waiting for the moment to discredit him. He tried to focus on caring for his mother, who, though grateful to be in the mansion, was also beginning to sense the tension in the air. That afternoon, while Lily rested, Noah decided to walk out to the gardens to clear his mind. The large grounds surrounding the mansion were filled with well-tended flowers, lush trees, and a tranquility that in other circumstances would have been comforting. But even there, far from the oppressive walls of the house, he couldn't shake the words of Laura and Bradley. He knew he didn't have much time before they made a more aggressive move. As he walked along the garden paths, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning around, he saw Mrs. Caroline approaching slowly, with her cane in one hand and a peaceful expression on her face. "You look thoughtful, Noah," she said with a soft smile. Noah tried to smile, but he knew Caroline could sense his discomfort. He couldn't hide his worries from her. "It's just, I'm not used to this kind of life," Noah admitted, feeling like he couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. "It's all so different." Caroline nodded, gazing at the horizon for a moment before responding. "I'm not surprised. Changing your environment so abruptly can be overwhelming. But I want you to know something, Noah," she said, looking him directly in the eyes. "This house, though it's a place of peace for some, also has its shadows. Family tensions can be complicated, but you and your mother are here because you deserve it, and that won't change." Noah felt a small sense of relief hearing those words, but he knew Caroline couldn't protect them from everything. The shadows she spoke of were more present than she herself realized. "Thank you, Mrs. Caroline," he replied, genuinely grateful. "I just want what's best for my mother." Caroline nodded, and with a look that suggested she knew more than she let on, gave him a reassuring squeeze on the arm. "Your mother is in good hands, Noah. And so are you. Don't worry about what others might think. I've seen you, and I know what you carry in your heart. Don't let anyone make you doubt yourself." With those words, Caroline returned to the mansion, leaving Noah alone once again in the garden. He stood there, deep in thought, knowing that while Caroline was on his side, the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Laura and Bradley were already scheming, and it would only be a matter of time before they tried something to push them out of the house. As dinner approached, Lily, though weak, decided to join them at the table. Noah worried about her presence, knowing the tension in the house was growing, but he also understood that she couldn't hide in her room forever. The dinner was silent, almost uncomfortable. Laura and Bradley maintained their usual coldness, while Mrs. Caroline tried to keep the conversation light, but Noah could feel the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Something bigger was brewing. With each bite, Noah sensed Laura and Bradley stealing glances at him, measuring every word and gesture. Finally, after a long period of awkward silence, Lily excused herself, exhausted from the effort of sitting at the table. Noah helped her to her room, ensuring she was comfortable before returning to the dining room. But when he re-entered, the tone of the conversation had shifted. "Noah," Laura began, her voice sharp and carrying an unmistakable edge. "Bradley and I have been talking. We want to make sure you understand the situation. My aunt is a very generous woman, but this house has rules, and everyone must respect them." Bradley nodded, his expression relaxed, but layered with meaning. "Exactly. We don't want any misunderstandings. We know your mother's situation is delicate, but we need to make sure everything is handled appropriately." Noah looked at them, fully aware of what they were implying, but chose not to respond immediately. He knew anything he said now could be twisted against him. Instead, he simply nodded. "I understand," he replied calmly. "I only want the best for my mother, and I'm grateful for Mrs. Caroline's hospitality." Laura smiled, but her eyes conveyed something else entirely. "I'm glad to hear that, Noah. After all, we all want what's best for the family." That night, as Noah prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an intruder in the mansion. While Mrs. Caroline had welcomed him with open arms, he knew the silent war with Laura and Bradley had only just begun. He needed to be ready for whatever was coming, and above all, he had to protect his mother from harm. As he lay down, one thought clung to his mind. Life in the mansion might be more luxurious, but the battles ahead would be far more dangerous. The next morning's sun illuminated the mansion's wide hallways, casting a warm glow over the tense atmosphere that lingered in the air. Noah had settled into a routine, helping his mother, who seemed to be improving a little each day thanks to the treatment, and avoiding Laura and Bradley as much as possible. But that day felt different. Mrs. Caroline had mentioned that her youngest niece, Haley, was returning to the mansion after spending several years abroad. The arrival of another family member could only mean one thing for Noah: more tension. Since overhearing Laura and Bradley's conversation, Noah had remained on high alert. He knew they saw his presence and his mother's as a threat, but he had no idea how Haley would react to finding them in the house. Would she be like her siblings, cold and distrustful, or perhaps different? That thought kept him restless all morning. As he wandered through the gardens trying to relax, he heard the sound of a car approaching the long driveway. Looking up, he saw a sleek black car pull up in front of the mansion, and out stepped a young woman with a quiet, natural elegance. Haley, with her dark hair neatly tied back and a calm expression on her face, seemed entirely different from Laura and Bradley. From a distance, Noah watched as Haley was greeted warmly by Mrs. Caroline with a heartfelt embrace. There was a clear bond between them, a warmth that didn't exist between Caroline and her other nieces and nephews. Noah wondered what kind of relationship she had with Laura and Bradley, but more importantly, how she would react to seeing him and his mother in the house. Later, when Noah returned inside, he found everyone gathered in the living room. Mrs. Caroline was speaking enthusiastically with Haley, telling her about life abroad. Laura and Bradley were there too, though silent, watching Haley with curiosity and, in Laura's case, a certain iciness. It was clear they hadn't expected their sister to get involved in the family affairs that had been brewing in the shadows. Noah lingered in the doorway, unsure if he should join them, but it was Mrs. Caroline who called him over. "Noah, come here. I want you to meet my dear niece, Haley," she said with a smile, drawing everyone's attention. Haley turned toward him, and Noah, feeling nervous, walked into the center of the room. He could feel Laura and Bradley's eyes on his back as he approached, but when he looked at Haley, her eyes held something different. Curiosity, not the disdain he had sensed from her siblings. "Nice to meet you, Noah," Haley said with a polite smile, extending her hand. "My aunt has told me about you." Noah shook her hand, feeling a slight sense of relief. Unlike Laura and Bradley, Haley seemed kind, though it was too early to fully trust her. "Nice to meet you too, Haley," Noah replied. "I hope your trip went well." Haley nodded, but before they could exchange more words, Laura interjected, as if feeling the need to reassert control. "Haley, there's a lot I need to catch you up on about what's been happening here," she said, her tone sweet but dripping with ulterior motives. "It's not quite what you expected, I'm sure." Haley looked at her sister with a mix of curiosity and caution, clearly aware that Laura rarely made innocent remarks. Though she didn't respond immediately, Noah could tell Haley wasn't going to be easily swayed by Laura's words. Later, Haley decided to take a walk through the mansion's gardens, enjoying the fresh air after her long journey. Noah watched her from afar, trying to figure out what role she might play in all of this. He knew that sooner or later, Haley would discover the underlying tensions in the house, and he wasn't sure how she would react. What he didn't expect was for her to approach him first. "Noah, do you mind if I walk with you?" Haley asked, surprising him. "No, not at all," he replied, slightly taken aback. As they walked together, Haley began asking casual questions, as if she were trying to get to know him better. "My aunt has told me a bit about you and your mother," she said softly. "It sounds like you've been through a lot." Noah, feeling that he could be honest with her, nodded. "Yes, it's been tough. My mother's been sick for a long time, and we had no way to afford the right treatment. Mrs. Caroline has been incredible helping us. I don't know what we would have done without her." Haley listened attentively, and Noah could tell she wasn't judging him like Laura and Bradley had. There was something different about her, a warmth that reassured him. "I know my siblings can be difficult," Haley said with a small smile. "I'm sure they've made you feel uncomfortable. They're protective of my aunt, but not always in the best way." Noah didn't know how to respond, but he appreciated Haley's honesty. It was clear that she saw the tension in the mansion, though she didn't yet know everything that was happening behind the scenes. "That's true. It's been complicated," Noah admitted. "I didn't expect them to welcome us with open arms, but I didn't think it would be this hard." Haley gave him a sympathetic look. "I understand. I've been away for a long time, and coming back, everything feels different. But if it helps, I don't let myself be easily influenced. I like to see the whole story before I make any judgments." Noah felt a wave of relief. While he wasn't sure if he could fully trust Haley yet, it was clear that she wasn't like her siblings. She wasn't quick to pass judgment without first understanding the situation. As the day wore on, Noah noticed that Haley began integrating herself into the family dynamics, but in her own way. She didn't participate in her siblings' subtle attempts to discredit Noah and his mother. Instead, she observed, listened, and formed her own opinions. Laura, on the other hand, seemed to be trying harder and harder to pull Haley into her plans to undermine Noah and Lily. But Haley seemed to keep her distance, not allowing herself to be dragged into her sister's manipulations. Noah couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. Perhaps, if Haley saw them for who they really were, a family desperate to survive, she could become an ally in what was quickly turning into a silent battle within the mansion. That night, as Noah prepared for bed, his thoughts were filled with both doubts and hope. Haley was an unknown factor, but so far, she had shown herself to be different from her siblings. Could he trust her? Or would she eventually side with Laura and Bradley? The only thing Noah knew for sure was that life in the mansion was changing rapidly, and each day seemed to bring new challenges. As he lay in bed, the soft sound of his mother's breathing from the next room comforted him, and he made a promise to himself. He would protect Lily, no matter what stood in his way. But now, with Haley in the picture, maybe he wouldn't have to do it alone. The atmosphere in the mansion remained tense, but Haley's arrival had brought a slight calm for Noah. Unlike her siblings, Haley didn't treat him with coldness or disdain. However, Noah knew that the peace he felt was fragile. Laura and Bradley were still plotting in the shadows, and he had to be prepared for any moves they made. In the days that followed, Noah noticed how Haley began to pay closer attention to what was happening in the house. She spent a lot of time with Mrs. Caroline, but also distanced herself from her siblings, as if she wanted to avoid any confrontations. Yet Noah knew it was only a matter of time before Haley started noticing the underlying tensions that seemed to permeate everything. One afternoon, while Noah was in the gardens tending to the flowers that were beginning to bloom, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Haley approaching, her expression serene. "Mind if I join you?" she asked with a kind smile. "No, of course not," Noah replied, stepping aside to make room for her. Haley knelt beside him, and for a while they worked in silence, tending to the plants. Noah couldn't shake the feeling that she had something on her mind, something she wanted to say, but hadn't yet found the right moment. Finally, Haley broke the silence. "I know my siblings have been difficult with you and your mother," she said, her tone revealing her discomfort. "I wanted to apologize on their behalf. It shouldn't be that way." Noah looked up, surprised. He had expected Haley to notice the hostility, but not to be so direct about it. "You don't have to apologize for them," Noah replied, feeling he could be honest. "It's not your fault. I knew this wouldn't be easy." Haley nodded, as if carefully considering her next words. "I've been observing Noah, and I've heard some things. My siblings are ambitious. They always have been. But what I didn't expect was for them to be so—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Desperate." Noah stared at her, sensing that she was about to reveal something important. "What do you mean by desperate?" Haley sighed, as if letting go of this truth was a burden she had carried for a while. "I've overheard conversations. Laura and Bradley are very concerned about what might happen with my aunt's inheritance. They don't trust you or your mother. They're afraid Mrs. Caroline might make changes, and they're planning something to stop it." Noah's heart raced. He had known Laura and Bradley saw him as a threat, but he hadn't realized their plans had progressed this far. "What kind of plans?" he asked, unable to hide his concern. Haley looked at him seriously. "I don't know all the details, but they're trying to discredit you in front of my aunt. They don't want her to trust you or your mother. They're looking for any mistake, any reason to make her doubt you, and they won't stop until they succeed." Noah felt a mix of anger and helplessness. He had known from the start that Laura and Bradley saw him as a threat, but now it seemed their plan was already in motion, and he had no idea how to stop it. "I don't know what to do," Noah confessed, his voice filled with frustration. "I don't want to cause trouble, but I can't just stand by while they try to push us out of here." Haley looked at him with a level of empathy Noah hadn't felt in a long time. Unlike her siblings, she didn't see Noah as a threat or an intruder. She seemed to understand his struggle. "You're right, you can't stand by," Haley said firmly, "but you can't confront them directly either. If you do, you'll only make my aunt doubt you more. Laura and Bradley are expert manipulators. They've always known how to get what they want, and if you try to expose them without proof, they could turn the situation against you." Noah looked at her, realizing that Haley was right. He couldn't let his emotions drive him to make a rash decision. He had to be smart, strategic. "What do you suggest I do?" he asked, seeking her guidance. Haley remained silent for a moment, thinking carefully. "First, you need to be smart. Don't give them any reason to attack you. Keep being who you are. Help your mother. Be kind to my aunt. That's what sets you apart from them. But at the same time, stay alert. My siblings won't act openly, but they'll leave clues. If we can find those clues, we can expose them." Noah nodded. He knew Haley was right. He couldn't confront them without evidence, but at least now he had an ally. "Thank you, Haley. I didn't expect you to support me in this," he admitted, feeling genuinely grateful. Haley smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "It's not just for you, Noah. My aunt has suffered a lot over the years. She's lost important people in her life, and Laura and Bradley are taking advantage of her vulnerability. I want to make sure she's surrounded by people who care for her, not those who are only looking out for their own interests. Noah felt a deep connection with Haley in that moment. They both wanted what was best for Mrs. Caroline, but they also knew they were up against two people who wouldn't stop at anything to get what they wanted. After his conversation with Haley, Noah felt more prepared, but he also knew the fight wouldn't be easy. As they sat down for dinner at the large dining table, Laura and Bradley maintained their usual cold and distant attitudes. However, Noah could feel their calculating glances aimed at him from time to time. He knew they were waiting for him to slip up, to say something they could use against him. Mrs. Caroline, oblivious to the underlying tension, continued talking about trivial topics, keeping the conversation light. But Noah, with Haley's warning fresh in his mind, observed every gesture and word from Laura and Bradley, searching for clues to their true intentions. Haley, meanwhile, remained calm, participating in the conversation while occasionally exchanging knowing glances with Noah when no one was looking. It was a reminder that even though he was surrounded by enemies, he was no longer alone. After dinner, Noah went to check on his mother. Lily lay resting in bed, visibly more at ease after several days of treatment. Though she wasn't fully recovered, there was noticeable improvement, giving Noah a small glimmer of hope. "How are you feeling, Mum?" Noah asked, adjusting her blankets. "Better, son. This place has been a blessing, though it still feels unreal to be here," Lily replied with a tired smile. Noah looked at her, feeling a mix of relief and concern. He knew his mother's survival depended on this opportunity, which made the looming threat of Laura and Bradley even more frightening. "Mum, no matter what happens, we're going to be fine. I promise," Noah said, trying to reassure her, even though he knew that promise was as fragile as their situation. Lily looked at him with pride, gently squeezing his hand. "You've always been strong, Noah. I know you'll do the right thing." Noah nodded, but inside, uncertainty gnawed at him. He knew he had to stay strong for his mother's sake, but he also knew the real battle at the mansion had only just begun. Days at the mansion passed in a tense calm, with an ever-growing sense that something was about to erupt. Noah and Haley had formed a silent alliance, though both knew that Laura and Bradley wouldn't stop until they got rid of them. Noah kept to his routine, helping his mother and fulfilling tasks for Mrs. Caroline, but the feeling of being constantly watched never left him. Haley continued to integrate into life at the mansion, but she kept her distance from Laura and Bradley. She was polite in her interactions with them, but it was clear she didn't share their goals. However, Noah knew that this delicate peace wouldn't last long. One morning, as Noah was preparing to head to the garden, he overheard a conversation between two servants in the kitchen. Though they spoke softly, their tone suggested something troubling was afoot. "I heard Laura and Bradley are meeting with the family lawyers," one servant whispered. "What could they be planning now?" the other responded curiously. "They're always up to something. I wouldn't be surprised if they were trying to take something from Mrs. Caroline." Noah froze upon hearing this. A meeting with the lawyers could only mean one thing. Laura and Bradley were advancing their plan to seize control of their aunt's inheritance. Time was running out, and the thought of what that meant for his mother filled him with dread. He decided to find Haley. If anyone could help him understand what was really going on, it was her. Noah found Haley in the living room, flipping through a book as sunlight streamed through the windows. She seemed calm, but when Noah approached, he noticed the concern in her eyes. "Haley, we need to talk," Noah said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Haley closed the book immediately and nodded. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone serious. Noah leaned in, uneasy. "I overheard the servants talking. They said Laura and Bradley are meeting with the family lawyers. I don't know what they're planning, but it has to do with Mrs. Caroline and the inheritance." Haley's brow furrowed in concern. "I knew this would happen sooner or later," she muttered. "My siblings are desperate to control my aunt's estate. If they're meeting with the lawyers, they might be planning something drastic, like changing the will or even legally incapacitating Mrs. Caroline. A pang of fear hit Noah. Incapacitating Mrs. Caroline would give Laura and Bradley total control over everything, including the fate of his mother and himself. "We can't let that happen," Noah said, his voice urgent. "If they get control, not only will we lose my mother's treatment, but Mrs. Caroline will be at their mercy." Haley nodded slowly, biting her lip in thought. "You're right. We can't let this go any further. But we need proof. If we go to my aunt and tell her what we suspect without evidence, Laura and Bradley will deny everything and accuse us of lying to protect our own interests." Noah knew she was right. They couldn't accuse Laura and Bradley without something solid to back them up. But how could they obtain that proof? "What do you suggest we do?" Noah asked, his mind racing. Haley remained silent for a moment, thinking. Finally, she looked up with determination in her eyes. "We need to find out what's going on with the lawyers. Not directly, but we need to access their meeting or the documents they're preparing. If we can see what Laura and Bradley are planning, we might be able to stop them." Infiltrating Laura and Bradley's legal affairs was risky, but it was their only option. Noah knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. "Okay, how do we do that?" Noah asked, ready to go along with the plan. Haley looked around, ensuring no one was nearby to overhear. "We need to talk to the mansion's butler, George. He's worked for my aunt for years and is completely loyal to her. If anyone can help us gain access to those documents or the meeting without Laura and Bradley finding out, it's him." Noah nodded. He had seen George around the mansion several times, and though the butler was discreet and reserved, he knew that George was fiercely loyal to Mrs. Caroline. If anyone could help them, it was him. That afternoon, Haley and Noah found George in the mansion's service wing. The man, impeccably dressed and with a serious yet kind demeanor, greeted them with a slight nod. "Miss Haley, Mr. Noah, how can I assist you?" he asked in his characteristically calm tone. Haley exchanged a glance with Noah before speaking. "George, we need your help," Haley began, her voice firm but cautious. "We know that Laura and Bradley have organized a meeting with the family lawyers, and we have reason to believe they're not acting in Mrs. Caroline's best interests. We need to know what they're planning." George looked at them silently for a moment, processing what he had just heard. Finally, he spoke in a grave voice. "I've worked for Mrs. Caroline for many years, and I've seen this family in all kinds of situations. If there's anything I can do to protect the lady, I will," he replied without hesitation. "I can find out more about the meeting and perhaps gain access to the documents they're preparing." Noah and Haley exchanged relieved looks. With George on their side, they had a better chance of uncovering Laura and Bradley's true intentions. "Thank you, George," Noah said sincerely. "We don't know what we'd do without your help." George nodded, his face serious but determined. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect Mrs. Caroline," he said, before leaving to begin his task. As the day drew to a close, Noah found himself in his room, reflecting on the events of the day. He knew they were approaching a critical moment, and that somehow he had to be ready for whatever came next. His alliance with Haley gave him some hope, but the risk remained high. He closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to overtake him. Tomorrow would be another day, and hopefully George would bring news that would help them get ahead of Laura and Bradley. But until then, the future remained uncertain. Noah knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. His mother, Mrs. Caroline, and now even Haley, depended on his ability to stay strong amid the storm of deception and manipulation. With that thought, Noah allowed himself to rest, though deep down he knew the real battles hadn't yet begun. The next morning arrived with a deceptive calm, but Noah sensed something important was about to happen. George had promised to gather information on Laura and Bradley's meeting with the lawyers, and Noah couldn't stop thinking about how crucial it was to get ahead of their enemies. During breakfast, the mansion was quieter than usual. Laura and Bradley hadn't shown up, which only heightened the feeling that something was happening in the shadows. Haley, seated next to him at the table, exchanged knowing glances with Noah. They both knew the countdown had begun. All they could do now was wait for George to return with news. The tension was palpable, and Noah felt a weight in his stomach, reminding him of how much was at stake. His mother remained resting in her room, and with each passing day, the pressure to secure her future increased. After breakfast, Haley suggested they walk in the gardens, away from the curious eyes of the servants. Both knew they needed to talk without being interrupted. "Are you nervous?" Haley asked as they walked among the flowers, her tone more relaxed than Noah felt inside. Noah nodded, not bothering to hide his anxiety. "I can't stop thinking about what's at stake. It's not just my mother, it's Mrs. Caroline too. If Laura and Bradley get what they want, everything will fall apart." Haley looked at him with empathy. Though her life had been different, she understood the emotional burden Noah carried. "I understand, Noah, but you're not alone in this. We'll find a way to stop them. We just need patience and the right evidence," she said, trying to encourage him. Before Noah could respond, they saw George approaching from the garden entrance. His pace was brisk, and his face, though always serious, looked more focused than usual. They knew he had news. "Miss Haley, Mr. Noah, I've found something that might interest you," George said in a low tone, ensuring no one else could hear. Haley and Noah exchanged looks before following George to a secluded corner of the garden. Once they were sure they were alone, George pulled a small envelope from his jacket and handed it to Haley. "These documents belong to the meeting Laura and Bradley had with the lawyers this morning. I couldn't be present, but I overheard enough and managed to obtain these copies. They contain a proposal that Laura and Bradley plan to present to legally incapacitate Mrs. Caroline," he explained gravely. Haley opened the envelope with trembling hands and, together with Noah, began reading the documents. What they saw made their stomachs drop. The documents suggested that Laura and Bradley were going to argue that Mrs. Caroline was no longer capable of managing her own affairs due to her advanced age and alleged mental frailty. They even referenced her recent erratic behavior, citing her decision to allow Noah and Lily to stay at the mansion as an example of her irrational decision-making. "This is worse than I thought," Haley said, her voice trembling with anger. "My siblings don't just want control of the inheritance. They want to ensure my aunt can't defend herself. If they manage to convince a judge that she's incapacitated, they'll have absolute power." Noah felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Not only were he and his mother in danger, but Mrs. Caroline stood to lose everything: her autonomy, her wealth, and her dignity. All because of her own nephew's greed. "We can't let this happen," Noah said firmly. "We have to show these documents to Mrs. Caroline." Haley nodded, though a shadow of doubt crossed her face. "You're right, but we need to be careful how we do it. This will devastate her, knowing that Laura and Bradley are plotting something like this. And if we don't handle it well, we could make things worse. My siblings are clever, and if they suspect we've found these documents, they might speed up their plan." Noah knew Haley was right. They couldn't just throw the documents in front of Mrs. Caroline without preparing her. They needed to find a way to reveal the truth without making her feel completely betrayed. Moreover, they knew that Laura and Bradley would be watching their every move. "What if we speak with Mrs. Caroline's trusted lawyer?" Noah suggested suddenly. "He could help us protect her legally before Laura and Bradley present this proposal. If we can get her lawyer involved, we might be able to stop them before they do anything irreversible." Haley looked at him, considering the idea. "That could work. My aunt trusts her personal lawyer deeply. If he's on our side, we could get ahead of my siblings. George, do you know where we can find him?" George nodded quickly. "I can contact him this afternoon. He often comes to the mansion to review some matters with Mrs. Caroline. If you explain the situation, I'm sure he'll take steps to protect her." Noah felt a spark of hope. It was a risky plan, but it was all they had. He knew they couldn't afford to fail. If Laura and Bradley went through with their plan, everything would be lost. George managed to contact Mrs. Caroline's personal lawyer, a man named Matthew Martinez. Matthew had been a close friend of the family for years and was well acquainted with the dynamics between Caroline and her nephews. When he arrived at the mansion, they received him in a small private parlor where Noah, Haley, and George explained the situation. Matthew listened carefully, his expression serious as he reviewed the documents George had obtained. "This is more serious than it seems," Matthew said finally, looking at Noah and Haley. "Laura and Bradley aren't just trying to control the inheritance. If they manage to legally incapacitate Mrs. Caroline, they'll gain access to all her financial decisions, including properties and bank accounts. And from what I see, they're using her act of generosity towards you as a basis for claiming she's no longer of sound mind." Noah felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he heard those words. Not only were Laura and Bradley manipulating the situation to gain power, but they were using his and his mother's arrival at the mansion as an excuse to justify their betrayal. "What can we do to stop it?" Haley asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. Matthew leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "The best way to counter this is with evidence that Mrs. Caroline is still fully capable of making decisions. We need to gather testimonies from people close to her who can confirm that she's mentally sound. Additionally, we could request an official medical evaluation to back it up. If we can prove that Caroline is mentally healthy, her nephews will have no grounds for incapacitating her." Noah nodded, understanding what that entailed. "So, how do we proceed?" he asked, ready to do whatever it took. Matthew looked at them with determination. "First, I'll speak with Mrs. Caroline. It's crucial that she understands what's happening, but I'll approach it delicately so as not to alarm her too much. Then, we'll start gathering the testimonies and arranging the medical evaluation. And most importantly, we'll keep all of this secret until we have enough evidence to stop Laura and Bradley." Haley and Noah exchanged relieved glances. The plan was in motion, and though they knew the road ahead would be difficult, at least they had a chance to save Mrs. Caroline and protect themselves. After the meeting with Matthew, Noah returned to his room. He was exhausted, but felt a renewed sense of determination. He knew the fight for control of the mansion wouldn't be easy, but at least now he had allies and a concrete plan. Before going to bed, Noah went to check on his mother, who was sound asleep. Staring at her tired yet peaceful face, he felt a surge of responsibility. Everything he was doing was for her, to give her the life she deserved. He wasn't going to let Laura and Bradley ruin everything he had fought for. With those thoughts in mind, Noah closed his eyes, knowing the days ahead would be decisive. The following days were filled with restrained tension. Noah and Haley worked discreetly, following Matthew's instructions to protect Mrs. Caroline without alerting Laura and Bradley. The mansion was quiet, but beneath that apparent calm, an invisible battle was being fought. Noah knew it was only a matter of time before everything erupted, and the weight of that uncertainty kept him constantly on edge. One afternoon, while helping his mother settle into her room, Noah received a call from George. The ever meticulous and discreet butler asked to meet him in the library of the mansion. Noah knew the news couldn't wait. Arriving in the library, he found Haley and Matthew waiting for him. The lawyer had a grave expression, which immediately set off alarms in Noah's mind. "What's going on?" Noah asked, his heart pounding. Matthew looked at both of them and sighed before speaking. "I've managed to confirm something important," he began. "Laura and Bradley are closer than we thought to filing for legal guardianship of Mrs. Caroline. The most concerning part is they've started bribing some of the staff at the mansion, offering money in exchange for testimony, claiming they've witnessed erratic behavior from Mrs. Caroline." Noah's heart sank. He knew Laura and Bradley were manipulative, but he hadn't imagined how far they would go. "What can we do?" Haley asked, trying to stay calm, though it was clear she was shaken. Matthew leaned in, lowering his voice. "We need to act quickly. I've already spoken with a trusted doctor who can perform an evaluation on Mrs. Caroline, but we must be careful. If Laura and Bradley catch wind of it, they could try to sabotage the process. We need to complete the evaluation in the coming days and make sure everything is officially documented." Noah nodded, but one question remained in his mind. "And Mrs. Caroline? How do we tell her?" he asked, worried about how the elderly woman would handle the betrayal of her own nephews. Haley looked at Matthew, knowing this was one of the hardest decisions they had to make. Matthew stayed silent for a moment before responding. "I'll speak with her, but we need to break it gently. Caroline has always had a special bond with Laura and Bradley, and though she might suspect they don't always have the best intentions, this truth could devastate her. We have to prepare her carefully so she doesn't completely lose trust in those around her." Noah knew there was no other option. They had to protect Mrs. Caroline, even if it meant breaking her heart, by revealing the treachery of her own family. The silence in the mansion was unsettling. Noah was in his room, staring out the window, when a soft knock sounded on the door. He opened it to find Haley standing on the other side, her face filled with concern. "Noah, can I talk to you?" she asked, her voice soft but laden with tension. Noah nodded, inviting her in. Haley walked to the center of the room but didn't sit. Instead, she paced nervously back and forth. "I can't stop thinking about how my aunt is going to react when she learns the truth," she finally said, stopping to look at him. "I know we have to do this, but it breaks my heart to think about how it will affect her. Laura and Bradley, they've always been ambitious, but I never thought they'd go this far." Noah understood. He had seen the special connection Mrs. Caroline had with Haley, and he knew she didn't want the elderly woman to suffer more than necessary. But he also knew there was no other choice. "I know it's hard, Haley," Noah said, moving closer, "but we're doing the right thing. Mrs. Caroline needs to know the truth, even if it hurts. If we don't tell her, Laura and Bradley could destroy everything she's built. We can't allow that." Haley nodded, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. It was clear she was struggling with the idea of betraying her own family, even if it was for a good cause. "You're right," she finally admitted. "I just hope that when all this is over, my aunt can forgive me for not acting sooner." Noah placed a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. "She will. She loves you, and she knows you're doing what's best to protect her." Haley smiled, though the sadness remained. Matthew arranged a private meeting with Mrs. Caroline in one of the quieter rooms of the mansion. Noah and Haley weren't present, but they knew that moment would be crucial. The lawyer had promised to handle the situation with the utmost care, but both of them knew it wouldn't be easy. Hours later, when Mrs. Caroline finally emerged from the room, her face showed a mix of sadness and resolve. She had clearly cried, but there was also something in her stance that suggested she was ready to fight. "I want to speak with both of you," Mrs. Caroline said as soon as she saw Haley and Noah, her voice filled with tense calm. The three of them gathered in the garden, where the fresh air seemed to ease some of the tension. Mrs. Caroline looked at them both with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "Matthew told me everything," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I can't believe what Laura and Bradley are doing, but I know it's the truth. For a long time, I tried to ignore the signs. I wanted to believe my nephews loved me and that everything they did was out of concern for me. But I was wrong." Noah and Haley exchanged a look, unsure of what to say. "I don't want to face this battle alone," Mrs. Caroline continued. "I need you both by my side. You've been loyal to me since you arrived, and though all of this is painful, I'm grateful for your honesty." Haley, with tears in her eyes, approached her aunt and hugged her tightly. "Aunt, I would never let them hurt you," she whispered as Mrs. Caroline returned the embrace. Noah, though more reserved, also felt a surge of emotion. Despite everything, Mrs. Caroline was willing to fight, and now they knew they had her full support in facing Laura and Bradley. With the plan in motion, Noah, Haley, and Matthew began working quickly. The doctor arrived at the mansion the next day to perform the official evaluation of Mrs. Caroline, and all the documents were prepared so that when Laura and Bradley attempted to file for legal guardianship, they would have medical evidence to refute it. However, Noah knew Laura and Bradley wouldn't just sit idly by. They were playing a dangerous game, and any mistake could ruin everything. That night, as Noah prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that the final confrontation was drawing near. They had managed to buy time and set a plan in motion, but there were still many unknowns. What would Laura and Bradley do when they discovered Mrs. Caroline was aware of their plans? And how would they react when their efforts were thwarted? Noah closed his eyes, knowing the days ahead would be decisive. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like they were one step ahead. The day dawned cold and quiet at the mansion, but Noah knew that calm wouldn't last long. After Mrs. Caroline's medical evaluation and the revelation of Laura and Bradley's betrayal, tensions in the house had reached a critical point. Although Mrs. Caroline was strong, she was still affected by the truth they had revealed, and Noah feared what her nephews would do once they found out their plans were about to be thwarted. Haley had spent the entire morning with her aunt, providing the support she so desperately needed. Their relationship had grown closer since the revelation, and Haley seemed more determined than ever to protect her. However, the air in the mansion was thick with uncertainty. Laura and Bradley didn't yet know their plan was in jeopardy, and it was only a matter of time before they found out. Noah spent most of the day with George, reviewing the documents Matthew had prepared. The lawyer had been thorough in ensuring everything was in order for the moment they needed to defend Mrs. Caroline legally. But even with everything they had done, Noah knew Laura and Bradley were dangerous, and they wouldn't be stopped easily. Around midday, as Noah walked through the mansion's halls, he heard voices coming from one of the sitting rooms. He immediately recognized them. Laura and Bradley were there, and they seemed to be arguing with each other. Noah felt a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. He knew their patience was running thin, and it was only a matter of time before they took more drastic action. He decided to move closer discreetly, staying out of sight but close enough to hear what they were saying. "This can't go on like this," Laura said, clearly frustrated. "We've been patient, but Aunt Caroline is losing control of everything. We can't let her keep making decisions that directly affect us. We need to act now." Bradley, with a calmer yet equally determined tone, replied, "I know, Laura, but we can't afford any mistakes. If we don't do this right, we could lose everything. We need to make sure everything is perfectly planned before we file. I've spoken to one of the lawyers, and he's on our side, but we have to be careful." Noah felt a chill run down his spine. It was clear that Laura and Bradley were not only determined to incapacitate Mrs. Caroline, but they were also securing key allies to ensure their plan was foolproof. "What about Noah and his mother?" Laura asked, her voice dripping with disdain. "They've been a problem from the start. Once we get control over Aunt Caroline, we can get rid of them quickly. They have no right to be here." Bradley chuckled softly. "Don't worry about them. Once we're in control, there will be no room for anyone else in this mansion." Noah felt his blood boil at those words. He knew Laura and Bradley saw his mother and him as obstacles, and that they would do whatever it took to remove them from their lives. What worried him most, however, was the possibility that their plan was already too far along. Without wasting any time, Noah decided to step away and find Haley. They needed to talk to Matthew immediately. That afternoon, Noah, Haley, and Matthew met in the library to discuss what Noah had overheard. Matthew, who had remained calm and methodical until now, seemed more concerned than usual. "This means Laura and Bradley are closer than we thought to filing for legal guardianship," Matthew said as he reviewed the documents. "If they have the backing of a lawyer, they could try to move quickly. We need to stay ahead of them." Haley, always the voice of reason, spoke up. "What do you suggest we do? We know time is limited, and if we don't act soon, they could surprise us with a move we can't block." Matthew nodded, thoughtful. "The first thing we need to do is make sure we have the official medical evaluation in our hands. That will be our main defense against any attempt to incapacitate Mrs. Caroline. Then we can file a preventive request with the court to protect her legal rights. If we do that, we can stop any attempt at manipulation by Laura and Bradley." Noah listened carefully, though he knew that wouldn't solve the problem immediately. "What if they try to come at us from another angle?" Noah asked. "They're already bribing the staff at the mansion. How can we make sure they don't do the same with the court or the doctors?" Matthew looked at Noah seriously. "It's a risk we can't eliminate entirely, but if we move quickly and secure the medical evidence, it will be much harder for them to manipulate the process. The important thing now is not to let them get ahead." Haley nodded, her expression resolute. "Let's do it. We can't let them keep playing with my aunt's life." That same night, as the tension in the mansion mounted, Matthew decided it was time to confront Laura and Bradley. With Mrs. Caroline's support and the legal plan in place, a family meeting was arranged in the mansion's main hall. Noah and Haley were present, alongside Mrs. Caroline, who, though visibly affected, remained firm. Laura and Bradley arrived, confused by the meeting. However, as soon as they entered the room and saw Matthew with the documents in hand, their expressions changed. "What's going on here?" Laura asked disdainfully, crossing her arms. Bradley, though calmer, watched the situation cautiously. Matthew stepped forward, his gaze firm and professional. "Laura, Bradley, we know what you've been planning. These documents I've gathered are proof that you've been attempting to incapacitate Mrs. Caroline without her consent. You've tried to manipulate the mansion's staff and bribe lawyers to control the inheritance." Laura froze, unable to hide the surprise on her face. Bradley, though more composed, appeared equally stunned. "That's not true," Laura finally said, her voice raised. "Everything we've done has been for our aunt's sake. She's no longer capable of making rational decisions, and someone needs to take charge." "That's not true," Haley exclaimed, stepping forward. "What you've done is betray our aunt's trust, all for your ambition and desire to control the family's fortune. You have no right to do this." Mrs. Caroline, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke with a calm yet firm voice. "I've trusted you both for years, and this is how you repay me. I never thought you'd go this far for money. But now I see everything clearly. I won't let you destroy what I've built, nor will I let you play with my life as if it were a piece in your game." Laura and Bradley remained silent, trapped without a credible defense. They knew they had been caught, and any attempt to deny their actions would only make things worse. "This isn't over," Bradley muttered, glancing at his sister. "We'll speak with our lawyers." Matthew, maintaining his composure, intervened. "You can do that, but I assure you, you won't succeed. Mrs. Caroline is legally protected, and the evidence is on our side. Any attempt to proceed with this plan will be stopped by the courts." Laura, defeated, said nothing more. She knew they had lost this battle. When the meeting ended, Noah and Haley breathed a sigh of relief. They knew the war wasn't over, but at least they had managed to stop Laura and Bradley's attack for the moment. Mrs. Caroline, though still hurt by her nephew's betrayal, expressed her gratitude to Noah and Haley for their loyalty. The bond between them had grown even stronger, and now they knew they would fight together to protect what was theirs. Noah, while watching the sky darken from his bedroom window, felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had managed to avoid disaster, but he knew the conflict with Laura and Bradley wasn't over. There were still many challenges ahead, and he would have to be prepared for whatever came next. But for now, at least, they had a small victory, and that was enough to keep moving forward. The day after the confrontation with Laura and Bradley was strangely calm. The tension still lingered in the mansion, but there was a sense of contained peace. Noah knew that although they had won an important battle, the war wasn't over. Laura and Bradley wouldn't give up easily, and that kept him on edge. Mrs. Caroline, though visibly affected, tried to maintain her composure. Her days were filled with visits from doctors, meetings with lawyers, and long conversations with Haley. Noah noticed that the time Haley spent with her aunt was strengthening their relationship, but it also seemed to be emotionally draining. It was clear the betrayal by Laura and Bradley still weighed heavily on her. Noah decided to spend the morning in the garden, seeking a break from the intensity that had dominated the mansion in recent days. As he tended to the plants, he lost himself in his thoughts, reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew the situation was still precarious, and that Laura and Bradley wouldn't wait long to make their next move. What he didn't know was when or how they would strike. Shortly after noon, George approached Noah with a serious expression. "Mr. Noah, I found something I think you should see," the butler said, his tone low and concerned. Noah stood up immediately, following George to Mrs. Caroline's study. Once inside, George showed him a sealed envelope he had found in one of Bradley's desks. "I don't usually snoop, but while organizing some papers, this caught my attention," George explained, his face full of worry. Noah took the envelope and opened it with trembling hands. Inside, he found a series of documents revealing something far more sinister than he had expected. Not only did they show that Laura and Bradley had been pulling strings to incapacitate Mrs. Caroline, but they had also started transferring part of the family's assets to private accounts overseas. It was a masterstroke designed to leave Mrs. Caroline with nothing, even if their incapacitation plan failed. "This can't be happening," Noah murmured as he examined the documents. It was worse than he had imagined. Laura and Bradley not only wanted control of the inheritance, they were actively stealing from Mrs. Caroline right under her nose. George, realizing the gravity of the situation, spoke firmly. "You need to show this to Mr. Matthew immediately. This changes everything." Noah nodded. He knew this discovery was the key they needed to stop Laura and Bradley once and for all, but he also knew this information could spark a much more dangerous conflict. Later that afternoon, Noah, Haley, and Matthew gathered in the library to discuss what he had found. Haley was visibly shocked upon seeing the documents, and Matthew, though always professional, couldn't hide his concern. "This goes beyond just an attempt to incapacitate," Matthew said as he reviewed the evidence. "This is theft. They're moving Mrs. Caroline's money and taking over her assets before they can be legally stopped." Haley, her face full of anguish, looked at her Uncle Matthew. "I can't believe they've done something so low. I knew they were ambitious, but this is a whole new level of betrayal. How did we not see this coming?" Matthew shook his head. "Laura and Bradley are cunning, and they've been extremely careful in how they've moved the money. But now that we have this evidence, we can stop them. We'll have to file a formal complaint and take this to court. If we don't act quickly, they could escape with everything." Noah looked at Haley, knowing the decisions ahead would be critical. "And what do we tell Mrs. Caroline?" Noah asked. "She's already suffered so much. If she finds out—" Haley took a deep breath before responding. "We can't hide it from her, but we need to handle it delicately. We know this will devastate her, but I also know she'll want justice. She won't let Laura and Bradley get away with this." Matthew nodded. "I'll give you a couple of days to prepare Mrs. Caroline. In the meantime, I'll gather everything we need for the complaint. Once it's ready, we'll need to file it without delay." Noah felt the weight of the situation. Even though they had gained some ground, they were now facing a far more desperate enemy. Laura and Bradley weren't just trying to control the fortune, they were willing to destroy everything their aunt had built for their own gain. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Noah couldn't sleep. He knew time was running out, and that Laura and Bradley would soon realize their plans had been exposed. It wouldn't be long before they made a move, and he needed to be ready. Suddenly, he heard a noise coming from the hallway. Following his instincts, he got up and carefully opened the door. There, in the darkness, he saw Bradley heading towards Mrs. Caroline's office. Noah followed him, keeping a safe distance to avoid being noticed. When Bradley reached the office, he turned on a lamp and began riffling through papers, clearly nervous. He knew something was wrong, and he seemed to be looking for evidence that could implicate him. Noah watched from the partially open door, debating whether he should intervene. Suddenly, Bradley froze. It was clear he had discovered that the incriminating documents were no longer where he had left them. "Damn it!" Bradley muttered, slamming his fist on the desk. At that moment, Noah decided to act. He opened the door fully and stepped forward. "Looking for something, Bradley?" Noah said, his tone calm but firm. Bradley spun around, surprised to see Noah, his face twisted into a mix of rage and fear. "What the hell are you doing here?" Bradley growled, trying to maintain his composure. "I could ask you the same thing," Noah replied, crossing his arms. "We know what you're doing. We know you and Laura have been stealing from Mrs. Caroline, and we have the proof. This ends now." Bradley was silent for a moment, his eyes burning with anger. "You have no idea what you're doing, kid," he spat. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Noah held his ground. "We'll see about that. Because once we take this to court, you'll see what you've done." Bradley clenched his jaw, clearly furious, but he knew he no longer had control of the situation. "I'm not going to let you destroy my life over this," he said, stepping toward Noah. "You're playing with fire." Noah didn't budge. "You've destroyed enough already. This ends now." After the confrontation with Bradley, Noah knew time was up. Laura and Bradley weren't going to stand idly by while their plans unraveled. The final showdown was just around the corner, and Noah, along with Haley and Matthew, would have to be ready to defend Mrs. Caroline and everything she stood for. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the mansion's windows, Noah mentally prepared himself for what was to come. He knew Laura and Bradley's next move would be desperate, and they'd have to act fast to protect themselves. But he also knew that for the first time in a long while, they were ready. The battle for control of the mansion, the inheritance, and Mrs. Caroline's legacy was about to reach its climax. And Noah was determined to ensure that truth and justice prevailed, no matter the cost. The tension in the mansion felt like a taut rope ready to snap. After the confrontation between Noah and Bradley the previous night, Noah knew the conflict was about to explode. Laura and Bradley were cornered, but they weren't the kind of people who would give up easily. That morning, the mansion was eerily quiet. Even the servants, who usually filled the halls with their daily routines, seemed to sense that something serious was about to happen. Noah braced himself for the worst. He had discussed the next steps with Haley and Matthew. The documents implicating Laura and Bradley in the embezzlement of Mrs. Caroline's funds were safely stored, and Matthew was ready to present them to the authorities when necessary. However, they all knew that Laura and Bradley would try something desperate to stop the truth from coming out. Around midday, as Noah and Haley were reviewing some papers with Matthew in the library, George burst into the room with a tense expression. "Mr. Noah, Miss Haley, you need to come immediately. Laura and Bradley are in the main hall, and they've brought their own lawyers." Noah's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected them to act so soon, let alone so brazenly. Haley looked at him, sharing the same concern. "This is a counterattack," Haley murmured. "They're going to try to intimidate us or pull something drastic." Matthew stood up immediately, his expression serious. "We're going to face them. They have no right to do anything without Mrs. Caroline's consent," he said, firmly closing the documents they had been reviewing. When they arrived at the main hall, Noah and Haley found Laura and Bradley standing side by side, their lawyers flanking them. Laura's gaze was cold, while Bradley wore a smug expression. Mrs. Caroline sat in her chair, looking uncertain and sad. "What's the meaning of this?" Haley asked, breaking the tense silence. "Why have you brought lawyers without telling Aunt Caroline?" Laura was the first to speak, her voice calculated and controlled. "We've done this because we want to protect our aunt from people who are clearly manipulating her," she said, casting a pointed look at Noah. "We know what you're trying to do, Noah, and we won't let you keep exploiting her generosity." Noah felt his anger rising, but before he could respond, Matthew calmly intervened. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Laura, but what you're doing here is entirely inappropriate. If you had any complaints, you should have addressed them legally and formally, not by bringing your lawyers here unannounced." Bradley stepped forward, a sarcastic smile on his lips. "Oh, but this is perfectly legal, Matthew. In fact, we've decided it's time to take action to ensure our aunt is in the right hands. That's why we're requesting that she sign over power of attorney, granting us temporary control of her financial affairs until a full evaluation of her mental capacity can be done." Mrs. Caroline froze upon hearing this. She knew what it meant. Noah, filled with indignation, stepped forward. "This is manipulation, and you know it. You have no right to do this. Mrs. Caroline is completely lucid, and you're just trying to take advantage of the situation to steal what belongs to her." Laura and Bradley's lawyers stepped in, trying to calm the situation. "Mr. Noah, we recommend that you keep your composure. This is a preventive measure to protect Mrs. Caroline, nothing more. We're not accusing anyone of anything," one of the lawyers said in a condescending tone. "We simply want to ensure her interests are well taken care of." Mrs. Caroline, though shaken, stood up from her chair with difficulty, but with dignity. "I won't sign anything," she said, her voice stronger than expected. "I don't need protection from Noah or Haley. You two are the ones who have betrayed my trust, and I won't let you take what's mine." Laura, visibly upset, struggled to keep her composure. "Aunt, we're doing this for your own good. You can't keep trusting people who clearly have their own agendas. Think about everything we've done for you over the years." But Mrs. Caroline wasn't swayed. "What you've done for me doesn't justify the theft and betrayal you're committing. I have proof that you've been moving my money into your own accounts, and that's unforgivable." Laura and Bradley's lawyers looked surprised by this revelation. It was clear they hadn't expected Mrs. Caroline to already be aware of what her nephews had done. Matthew seized the moment, pulling out the documents from his briefcase and showing them to everyone present. "Here are the records of the transfers Laura and Bradley made to their private accounts. This is a serious crime, and we're preparing to file a formal complaint. I suggest you reconsider your position before the consequences become even more severe." Laura and Bradley, seeing the documents, fell silent. It was clear they hadn't expected their plan to be exposed so soon. Their lawyers, who had arrived confident, now showed signs of discomfort. "This is all a misunderstanding," Bradley tried to say, though his tone was no longer as arrogant. "We were just reorganizing the accounts to make sure everything was in order." But no one believed him. After a tense exchange, it became clear that Laura and Bradley couldn't proceed with their plan. Mrs. Caroline, with Matthew's support, demanded that her nephews leave the mansion immediately. Realizing they had no other option, Laura and Bradley's lawyers advised them to leave for now. Laura, humiliated, didn't say another word. Bradley, still seething, knew they had lost this battle. "This isn't over," he muttered as he headed for the door. "We'll be back with more evidence, and when we do, there won't be anything you can do to stop us." But in that moment, those words held no weight. Laura and Bradley left the mansion, utterly defeated. After they were gone, the mansion fell into an eerie silence. Mrs. Caroline, exhausted by the confrontation, sank into her chair, and Haley rushed to her side to comfort her. Noah, meanwhile, felt a mixture of relief and concern. They had won an important battle, but he knew the war was far from over. Matthew approached Noah and patted him on the shoulder. "You did well, Noah. This isn't over, but we've taken an important step in protecting Mrs. Caroline." Noah nodded, though deep down he knew there was still much to be done. Laura and Bradley would return, and when they did, they would be more determined than ever. Noah went to his mother's room, as he did every night. Lily, who was already aware of what had happened, greeted him with a warm smile, though her health remained fragile. "You're doing everything you can, son. I'm proud of you," she said, taking his hand. "Just make sure you take care of your heart in the midst of all this." Noah smiled, though fatigue weighed heavily on him. He knew he had to stay strong, not just for his mother, but for Mrs. Caroline and everyone else who depended on him. As night fell over the mansion, Noah couldn't help but think about what was coming next. He knew Laura and Bradley's next move would be more dangerous, but he also knew that he was no longer alone in this fight. With Haley, Matthew, and Mrs. Caroline by his side, he felt that, for the first time in a long time, he had a real chance of emerging victorious. After Laura and Bradley's humiliating defeat, the atmosphere in the mansion seemed lighter, but Noah wasn't fooled by the temporary calm. Although they had managed to thwart their cousin's attempt to seize control of Mrs. Caroline's fortune, everyone knew the war wasn't over. Laura and Bradley, humiliated, would retreat to plan their next move, and that thought kept Noah from sleeping soundly. In the days that followed, life in the mansion tried to return to normal. Mrs. Caroline, though more at ease after the confrontation, was still deeply affected by her nephew's betrayal, and Noah could see the sadness in her eyes. Haley was constantly by her side, offering emotional support, while Noah and Matthew continued to work on the legal front to ensure Caroline's finances were fully protected. However, amid this apparent normality, Noah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The uncertainty made him more alert than ever, always watching and waiting for Laura and Bradley's next move. One afternoon, as Noah was reviewing some papers in Matthew's office, George entered the room again, his face paler than usual. "Mr. Noah," he said, his voice tense. "An official notice has arrived. Laura and Bradley have filed a lawsuit in court." Noah's heart stopped for a second. Although he knew something like this could happen, he hadn't expected them to act so quickly. He stood up abruptly and took the letter George handed him. As he opened it, he read in disbelief. Laura and Bradley were suing Mrs. Caroline for financial incompetence and requesting a new medical evaluation, claiming that previous tests had been tampered with. They were also using false testimonies from some bribed employees who claimed to have seen Mrs. Caroline behaving erratically in recent months. "This is a trap," Noah said aloud, his hands trembling as he held the document. George nodded gravely. "They're trying to pull the same trick, but this time with more force. If they manage to convince the court, we could lose control of everything." Noah knew this complicated everything. Laura and Bradley had played their most dangerous card. Now, more than ever, they needed to act quickly. Noah immediately went to find Haley and Matthew. He found them in the library, where Matthew was reviewing some legal documents while Haley rested in a chair. The tension in the air was palpable. "You need to see this," Noah said, handing them the notice. Matthew took the document, and as he read it, his expression hardened. "I knew they would do something, but I didn't expect them to take it this far so quickly," he said, his tone full of concern. Haley, after reading the notice, covered her mouth with her hand. "False testimonies," she said, her voice trembling. "I can't believe they bribed employees to back up their lies." "This is an act of desperation," Noah said. "They know they don't have real evidence, so they're trying to create a false image of Mrs. Caroline to convince the court." Matthew nodded, but his expression wasn't optimistic. "This makes things much more complicated. Even though we have proof that Mrs. Caroline is fully capable, courts can be slow, and if Laura and Bradley manage to sow enough doubt, they could buy themselves enough time to do more damage. We're going to have to fight on two fronts, proving the testimonies are false and preventing the court from granting them any temporary control over the assets." Haley looked at Noah, worried. "And what can we do to prove the testimonies are false?" Matthew leaned forward, his fingers interlocked, thinking of the strategy. "First, we'll need to talk to the employees who were bribed and try to get one of them to confess the truth. If we can get one of them to retract their statement, Laura and Bradley's entire case will fall apart. We can also gather additional witnesses who have been around Mrs. Caroline and can testify in her favor, showing that she's always been lucid." Noah felt a spark of hope at the plan. It was risky, but they had no other option. "George," Noah said, turning to the butler who had remained silent, "can you talk to the employees and see if any of them are willing to confess what's really happening?" George nodded, his expression determined. "I'll do my best, Mr. Noah. I know who's been closest to Laura and Bradley, and I can try to convince them to tell the truth." Noah felt grateful. He knew George was a trusted person, and if anyone could get the truth, it was him. Later, Noah went to see Mrs. Caroline, knowing he had to inform her about what was happening. He found her in her room, resting in a chair by a window that overlooked the garden. Although she looked well physically, Noah could see the emotional weight of the situation taking its toll on her. "How are you, dear?" Caroline asked when she saw him enter, smiling weakly. "I'm fine, Mrs. Caroline," Noah replied, approaching her. "But there's something I need to tell you." Noah sat beside her and explained what had happened. Mrs. Caroline listened in silence, and although she was already accustomed to her nephew's betrayals, this new maneuver seemed to affect her more deeply. When he finished, she sighed with sadness. "I can't believe they've gone this far," she said, her voice breaking. "After everything I've done for them, is it still not enough?" Noah gently took her hand, trying to comfort her. "This isn't your fault, Mrs. Caroline. Laura and Bradley only see the money. They don't see everything you've given them. But we're not going to let them win. Matthew, Haley, and I are with you in this, and we're going to fight to make sure the truth prevails." Caroline nodded, but Noah could see the tears forming in her eyes. "Thank you, Noah. I don't know what I would do without you," she whispered. Noah stayed with her for a while longer, knowing that Caroline's emotional battle was just as big as the legal one. The next day, George returned with important news. He had spoken to several of the employees and finally managed to get one of them, a young gardener named Kyle, to confess that he had been paid by Laura to falsely testify against Mrs. Caroline. Kyle, feeling guilty, had agreed to retract his statement and give a new testimony in favor of the truth. When George told Noah, Haley, and Matthew about it, hope blossomed within all of them. "If we can get Kyle to testify in court that the testimonies were bought, we can dismantle the entire case against Laura and Bradley," said Matthew, his tone more optimistic than before. "Still, we must be ready for them to try a counterattack in some other way." Haley smiled, relieved for the first time in days. "This could be the end of their plan," she said. "If we can expose them as liars, no one in the court will ever believe them again." Noah, though relieved, knew they had to be cautious. Laura and Bradley wouldn't stop easily, but with Kyle's confession and Matthew's support, he felt they had a real chance of winning. As they prepared for the legal battle ahead, Noah knew the decisive moment was near. Laura and Bradley had played their most dangerous card, but now, with the truth on their side, he and his allies held a crucial advantage. However, he knew he had to be ready for anything. The coming days would be tough, but he was determined to protect Mrs. Caroline and ensure Laura and Bradley wouldn't get away with their plans. The day of the trial had arrived. The tension in the mansion was palpable as Noah, Haley, Mrs. Caroline, Matthew, and George prepared to face Laura and Bradley in court. This was the decisive moment, the culmination of a battle that had begun weeks ago with small acts of betrayal, now culminating in a legal confrontation that could destroy Mrs. Caroline's legacy forever. Noah stood beside Haley at the mansion's entrance, waiting for the car that would take them to court. The sky was grey, threatening a storm, and the air felt heavier than usual. Worry was etched on Haley's face, but determination burned in her eyes. "Today we'll win, Noah," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly. "We can't let them destroy everything my aunt has built." Noah, equally tense, nodded. "We will, Haley. No matter what they have planned, we're prepared," he replied, though he couldn't help the knot in his stomach tightening. The courtroom was packed. The presence of the press, lawyers, and curious onlookers made the atmosphere stifling. Laura and Bradley arrived before everyone, exuding a cold confidence that seemed unshakable. They sat with their lawyers at the front, their gazes defiant and filled with contempt. It was clear they weren't going to give up easily. Mrs. Caroline, elegantly yet simply dressed, entered the courtroom with Matthew and George by her side, while Noah and Haley followed closely behind. The place seemed too small for the weight of the situation that was about to unfold. "Don't worry, Aunt," Haley murmured as they took their seats. "Everything will be fine. We have Kyle, and he'll show the judge the truth." Mrs. Caroline, though calm, offered a small, sad smile. "It's not just about me, Haley. It's about everything we've lost in this fight. Laura and Bradley. I don't recognize them anymore. Their betrayal hurts more than anything else." Before Haley could respond, the room fell silent as the judge entered and took his seat. The trial had begun. Laura and Bradley were the first to present their case. Their lawyers argued that Mrs. Caroline was no longer fit to manage her fortune and that the previous medical evaluation had been tampered with. The testimonies of the bribed employees were presented as evidence, and some of them, clearly nervous but determined to fulfill their agreement, claimed that Mrs. Caroline had experienced erratic episodes in recent months. Bradley was called to the stand, and as he took his place, he began to speak with the voice of a concerned nephew, though everyone in the room knew it was just an act. My aunt has always been a strong woman, but lately, we've seen her mental health deteriorate. It's not easy for me to be here, but I must do this for her well-being. We don't want her to be exploited by people who may have ulterior motives, he said, casting a direct glance at Noah. Noah felt the anger rise within him, but kept his composure. He knew his moment would come soon. When it was Mrs. Caroline's turn, her lawyer, Matthew, defended her with solid arguments. He spoke of Caroline's integrity and lucidity, supported by the official medical evaluation that had already been conducted. However, the climax of the defense was about to come. "We call Kyle Rivera to the stand," Matthew announced, his voice firm and resonating in the room. Kyle, the young gardener who had confessed to being bribed, walked towards the stand with uncertain steps. All eyes were on him, and the tension was unbearable. As he arrived, he briefly glanced at Noah, who returned a look of support, knowing this was the key moment. Kyle swallowed hard and began his testimony. "I was one of the employees Laura and Bradley offered money to in exchange for testifying against Mrs. Caroline. I did it out of necessity, but I deeply regret it. The truth is, Mrs. Caroline never showed any erratic behavior. She's always been in full control of her faculties. Laura and Bradley paid me to lie." Kyle's words dropped like a hammer in the room. A murmur spread through the audience, and Laura, who had maintained an impenetrable facade until that moment, seemed to freeze. Bradley, on the other hand, clenched his teeth in fury. "That's a lie," Bradley shouted, standing up abruptly. "He's making it all up to save his skin." The judge banged his gavel forcefully, calling for order in the court, while Bradley continued to shout. "This is a conspiracy," he bellowed. "I won't let them take what's rightfully ours." Laura tried to calm her brother, but the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The pent-up anger from weeks, perhaps years, exploded in that moment. Bradley, unable to contain himself, crossed the line. "This is all a farce," he yelled, his eyes filled with rage, pointing at Mrs. Caroline. "You've always been weak, Aunt. You never had what it takes to manage that fortune. We should have had it from the start." The silence that followed those words was deafening. Laura, incredulous, looked at him as if he had just destroyed any chance they had left. Mrs. Caroline, though hurt, remained calm, but it was clear Bradley's words had deeply affected her. The judge, having seen enough, raised his hand to stop any further comments from Bradley. "Enough," he said, his tone cold and authoritative. "I've heard both sides, and it's clear that this is not just a family dispute, but a betrayal against Mrs. Caroline. I will make my decision based on the evidence presented, but let it be clear, Bradley and Laura's behavior is unacceptable in this court." Laura, seeing defeat, slumped in her chair. The judge left to deliberate, leaving the room in silence. Everyone knew the scales had tipped in Mrs. Caroline's favor, but one last piece still needed to fall. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned to the room. Everyone held their breath. "After reviewing the evidence and testimonies, I've reached a conclusion," the judge said, looking at everyone in the room. "It is clear not only that Mrs. Caroline is in full control of her mental faculties, but also that there is sufficient evidence that Laura and Bradley attempted to manipulate and bribe witnesses to build a false case against her." Laura and Bradley seemed to shrink in their seats as the judge continued. "Therefore, I reject Laura and Bradley's request to gain control of Mrs. Caroline's assets. Furthermore, due to the evidence of manipulation, I will recommend a formal investigation into Laura and Bradley's financial activities to determine if any other crimes were committed. The room erupted in murmurs, and Noah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. They had won. Mrs. Caroline was safe, and Laura and Bradley would face the consequences of their actions. As they left the courthouse, the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke. The rain fell hard, but no one in Noah, Haley, Mrs. Caroline, or Matthew's group seemed to notice. The sense of relief was more powerful than anything else. Mrs. Caroline, though exhausted, stopped at the courthouse door and looked at Noah with a mix of gratitude and pain. "Thank you for everything you've done, Noah. I don't know what I would have done without you and Haley," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. Noah, deeply moved, hugged her gently. "I just did what I had to do, Mrs. Caroline. You're part of my family now. I wasn't going to let them destroy you." Haley, standing beside them, watched the scene with a smile, knowing that although they had won this battle, the wounds of betrayal would take much longer to heal. But for now, they could breathe in peace, knowing that the truth had prevailed. The air in the mansion seemed lighter, as if a storm had passed, leaving a moment of calm after the victory in court. However, though the legal battle was over, and Mrs. Caroline had regained full control of her life and assets, the wounds of Laura and Bradley's betrayal still weighed heavily on everyone's hearts. Noah woke up that morning with the sense that something had profoundly changed. The constant fear of losing everything no longer hung over him, but the emptiness left by the confrontation was hard to ignore. He quickly dressed and went to see his mother, Lily, who had become more stable since they moved into the mansion. "How are you, Mum?" Noah asked as he entered her room. Lily looked at him with a peaceful smile, something that had become more frequent since her health had improved. "I'm feeling much better, son. Thanks to you and everything you've done. You know, I've been thinking a lot lately. All that we've been through has shown me how important it is to have people who support you." Noah nodded, but deep inside, he still felt the weight of the emotions he had been suppressing. He knew the battle had been tough on everyone, especially Mrs. Caroline. "Mom, the worst is over. But I'm worried about Mrs. Caroline. Laura and Bradley's betrayal has affected her more than she lets on," Noah admitted, sitting on the edge of the bed. Lily sighed, nodding. It's natural for her to feel that way. They didn't just try to take her fortune, they broke her trust. Recovering from a betrayal like that takes time. But Noah, she's lucky to have you and Haley by her side. What you've done for her is priceless. Noah smiled, grateful for his mother's words, but he couldn't shake the thought of how much more needed to be done to heal the emotional scars the battle had left on everyone. Later that morning, Noah went to the main hall, where he found Mrs. Caroline and Haley in a serious conversation. As he entered, he saw the suitcases piled near the front door and knew what was about to happen. Laura and Bradley were ready to leave the mansion, part of Mrs. Caroline's decision to completely sever ties with them. Shortly after, Laura and Bradley arrived at the hall, escorted by a lawyer and a few assistants carrying their belongings. The atmosphere was tense, and no one spoke at first. Mrs. Caroline, with her characteristic serenity, slowly rose from her chair and looked at her nieces with a sadness that seemed deeper than she could express. "Laura, Bradley," Caroline began, her voice trembling slightly. "I never thought this day would come. I won't repeat what you did to me. That has already been made clear. I just want to say that, despite everything, I still love you, but I can't allow you to remain a part of my life after what you've done." Laura tried to speak, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. Bradley, always more arrogant, held his head high, but even he seemed affected by the farewell. "We never wanted it to end like this," Laura finally said, breaking the silence. "We made mistakes, but it wasn't out of hate. We just wanted what we thought was right for us." "Right?" Mrs. Caroline responded, with a mix of disbelief and pain. "Stealing, betrayal, lies. That's not justice. I can't forgive you for what you tried to do. But despite everything, I hope you find peace in your lives. This ends here." With those words, Mrs. Caroline turned away, refusing to look at her nieces as they left the mansion for the last time. Laura and Bradley left in silence, not looking back. When the door closed, the weight of what had happened seemed to fall on everyone. Hayley, tears in her eyes, approached her aunt and hugged her. "You did the right thing, Aunt," Hayley whispered. "Now you can start healing." Mrs. Caroline, though grateful for Hayley's support, couldn't hold back a small sob, finally releasing all the pain she had been holding in for so long. Noah, watching the scene, realized that emotional battles were much harder to win than legal ones. Days later, Mrs. Caroline, in an unexpected gesture, summoned everyone to her office. There was something solemn in her tone that made both Noah and Hayley know it was something important. When they arrived, they found her sitting behind her large desk, with several documents laid out in front of her. "I've made a decision," Mrs. Caroline said, her voice full of determination. "For a long time, my life revolved around this mansion, protecting what my husband and I built. But now I realize that the most valuable thing I have isn't this place, nor even the money, but the people around me. You," she added, looking at Noah, Hayley and Lily, with eyes filled with affection. Hayley looked at her with curiosity. "What decision are you talking about, Aunt?" Caroline took a deep breath before continuing. "I've decided to transfer not only the ownership of the mansion, but also a considerable portion of my assets to you, Noah and Hayley. You've shown that money and power aren't what you seek. You understand what's truly valuable in life, and I want you to be the guardians of this legacy when I'm no longer here." Noah's eyes widened in surprise. Although he already knew Mrs. Caroline had entrusted him with the mansion's care, he hadn't expected her to make such a definitive and all-encompassing decision. "Mrs. Caroline, I can't accept this just like that. You've already done so much for me and my mother. I don't know if I'm the right person to handle all this," Noah said, his tone humble and sincere. But Caroline smiled, a warm and reassuring smile. "It's precisely because you doubt yourself that I know you're the right one, Noah. The humility, loyalty, and love you've shown are priceless. I trust you more than I've trusted anyone in many years. I want this house and everything it represents to remain in good hands. And Hayley, I know you'll be a key part in keeping everything together," she added, looking at her niece with a smile full of pride. Hayley, visibly emotional, leaned towards her aunt and hugged her tightly. "Thank you, Aunt. You don't know what this means to me, to all of us." Mrs. Caroline nodded, her eyes shining with held-back tears. "You've been the light in my darkness, and I want you to know that no matter what happens in the future, I'll always be here, with you, in spirit." That night, as the moon lit up the mansion's gardens, Noah and Hayley walked in silence along the paths, reflecting on the magnitude of what Mrs. Caroline had done for them. The gift she had given them wasn't just material. It was a symbol of trust, a recognition of the love and loyalty they had shared. "This is bigger than I thought we could handle," Noah said, breaking the silence. "But at the same time, I feel like it's the start of something new." Hayley looked at him, her face illuminated by the moonlight. "It is, Noah. This isn't just an inheritance. It's an opportunity to build something together, to keep everything Mrs. Caroline created alive and strong, and also to start writing our own story." Noah smiled, feeling a strange mix of peace and excitement for what the future held. He knew that, though life had placed them on a difficult and challenging path, they had emerged victorious, not only because of their actions, but because of the strength of the bond they had forged. "Yes," Noah said, looking up at the starry sky. "We're starting something new, and this time, we'll do it right. Together." Hayley intertwined her fingers with Noah, and at that moment, they both knew that the true legacy Mrs. Caroline had given them wasn't simply a mansion or a fortune, but the opportunity to find love, hope, and a new future. Noah walked alone through the garden. the fresh morning air allowing him to reflect in silence. He had been through so much since helping Mrs. Caroline cross that street. He never imagined that a simple act of kindness would trigger a series of events that would change his life forever. The mansion, which once seemed so distant and foreign to him, was now his home. But what impacted him the most wasn't the material wealth he had found along the way. It was the most important lesson of all. The true riches in life are not measured by money, but by what you give to others. Sitting under a tree, Noah thought about everything he had learned. Helping Mrs. Caroline, protecting her when she needed it most, that gave me something more valuable than any fortune, he murmured to himself. It gave me a family, a purpose, and it taught me that when you help from the heart, the world gives back much more. He remembered the tough moments, the betrayals, the struggles, but beyond all that, he remembered the connections he had made, his bond with Haley, the respect from Mrs. Caroline, and the new life he had built with his mother. All of that was far more meaningful than any amount of money. Haley approached, interrupting his thoughts. She sat beside him and smiled. "You're deep in thought," she said softly. Noah looked at her, a calm smile on his face. "I was thinking about everything we've been through, about what really matters. In the end, all of this isn't about material wealth, but about the people we have by our side and what we do for them." Haley nodded, understanding the meaning behind his words. "That's the greatest wealth of all," she responded. Noah knew he had found the most important lesson of his life. Helping others, giving without expecting anything in return, was the foundation for gaining unlimited wealth. Not in the material sense, but in the deep, heartfelt one. And so, with a peace he had never felt before, Noah looked toward the future, knowing he was already a truly wealthy man. Thank you for watching this story. If you liked it, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more content. See you in the next video.